He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right. Anders William Berg, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
Thank you. I'm doing quite well. It's autumn here in Sweden. I almost said it's autumn over there as well. But it's a lovely day. I'm in a good mood. So, yeah.
Look, it is, like you said, it is fall in the American South, which means it is cold and rainy and miserable. So, not the best day, but I won't complain about it. I heard your recent interview on the Good Old Boys podcast. It was very interesting, where you spoke about sort of the injection of politics into tabletop role-playing games, particularly Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm going to have you introduce yourself before we dig into that. I just want to assure the audience that is a prism we are going to use to talk about a wider issue. It's not just going to be us nerding out. That will feature, but this will be interesting to many more people than simply tabletop gamers. Right? It's describing a pattern you have seen in your life. But before we do that, how about you introduce myself to your audience who might not be familiar with your work?
Yeah, my name is Anders William Berg. I'm Swedish. I'm not a very interesting person in my everyday life. I'm a kindergarten teacher. I've never written anything in English before, so I'm probably a complete no-name to most people. But I have a blog called Mark of the Weather Sun, where I wrote this really long essay on the rise of woke D&D, and that was supposed to be a sort of among other things, it was supposed to be like a case study of the rise of wokeness and the mechanisms behind it. Other than that, I'm politically active here in Sweden. Some people might know of a man called Marcus Allard, and Malcolm Shiune, who have been on the Good Old Boys podcast that you mentioned, and I'm sort of in their camp, so to speak. That's me.
Well, great. And obviously you are a player of tabletop games. So I'm curious, many people have noticed sort of the rise of wokeness, but for a lot of people, I think it hit with Gamergate, right? The kind of 2014 culture war stuff. I mean, I was a bit young for that, but I found that in university. I've said this before. I actually was forced to take a class on Gamergate at university, which is weirdly how I ended up here. I hated that class so much that I was like, oh, well, who do you hate? Those are my new friends. Just a bizarre thing. But when did you notice the rise of progressive politics in your hobby?
Well, I framed it in the article. The first time I heard about it is that Wizards of the Coast, who's the publisher of Dungeons and Dragons, they released an adventure module or a dungeon that was the first wheelchair accessible dungeon. And I assumed that this must be a joke from the company, because just at face value, if you have like an evil lich or whatever, why would he make it accessible for wheelchair bound adventurers to more easily kill him?
Take over the world, but he cares very deeply that it's wheelchair accessible. It is comedic, right?
Yeah, but when you hear that, like, it's hard to imagine, even if you are the most progressive minded person in the world, it's hard to hear that and not think that this must be a conscious joke. This must be like presented as a joke. But in fact, it was not. And this sort of, a lot of these things about wokeness are just kind of ridiculous, and it's not worth thinking so much about. But it was pretty interesting how hard they started to market all of their products as being like the first wheelchair accessible dungeon. Orcs are no longer racist depictions of African Americans, which they apparently were, and now we're dealing with the inherent racism of Dungeons and Dragons. It's sort of weird when like a real company producing commodities for profits start doing these things that seem completely irrelevant to the hobby and just illogical and stupid at like a surface level. So, and that was back in 2021, I think. But I think the history of woke D&D goes back to June 2020. I have some very specific dates here. But there was also, I've come to realize, like a long prehistory of this, where there were designers in the scene who weren't explicitly woke back then. That wasn't really a big term, but they were sort of pretentious art people trying to elevate the hobby. And they tried to introduce elements of story gaming and stuff like that. And that's been an element in gaming for a very long time. People being uncomfortable with video games and tabletop games being for what we would today call like incel nerds, and trying to make it more respectable and stuff like that. And, you know, to each their own. But it has become a very dominant phenomenon in most of gaming.
Well, definitely. And to that point, even if I don't like it, there are certain kind of elements of progressive politics that make sense within like a strictly profit-seeking framework. Like, to me, I can understand why, you know, Raytheon would have a gay advocacy group for their employees. That makes sense to me. But when it is a very narrow product for a very specific section of the market, and it is being fully and totally inundated with very niche, I guess, progressive points, right? Like, who is asking for this? It seems very suspicious. It seems as if it has been sort of organized. And so let's speak to that sort of organization there, right? If we assume that this is not organic, who is pushing it? You mentioned that even before the kind of, I guess, surfacing of this, there were designers, there were creators behind it pushing these politics.
They released the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and there was this big feud back then about, let's call them story gamers and people preferring emergent gameplay, where you just design the mechanics and the stories would be developed by the players themselves. But you had these sort of story gamers wanting to enforce you having to tell the story in a certain way. Let's just say that. And the thing about them is that they were always whiners and losers on the margin. They had no influence whatsoever. There was this guy, I don't know what his title was, but Mike Merles was the lead designing guy of Dungeons and Dragons. And he was in these controversies where he was accused by, I like the term woke scolds. They were basically woke scolds trying to shame him for platforming designers who were accused of all kinds of things, racism and sexism and so on. But he, like, for 5 years, he survived the onslaught of these people. They had no power and they were pretty much like a joke in the scene. But something really shifted in 2020. And in the article, I'm dividing it into like a triadic structure. I'm using English words very creatively now, but it's not my first language. Of consumers, capital, and consultants. And consultants are these book professional writers. And the thing, it's always been claimed that there was like an uproar in the so-called community of the game, where people were very upset with the supposed racism and so on. And that claim has never been proven, of course. And the evidence that people present for there being, like, I go through it in the article, but there was like an open letter involving like 14 people who were very upset about Magic the Gathering, which is also a game produced by Wizards of the Coast, not having enough like racial quotas on their tournaments and stuff like that. And that was like the casus belli of this entire crusade. And all I'm trying to say is that this was like, from the players of the game, this had no, like, they have never proven that this had like a great basis in reality, people being upset with the game. But something that happened in 2020, what I think you're very familiar with, is the death of a man called George Floyd and the riots and protests that came with that. And, well, I shouldn't get too ahead of myself, but on June 1st, 2020, Wizards of the Coast releases a statement where they basically say that we've been excluding the black and brown community from the game for too long now, and we need to make amends for that. And then things started to change rapidly, leading up to the formation of something called the inclusivity review process, where outside consultants were hired to go through every product produced by the company, making sure they didn't have hateful language and stuff like that. And it's really, in Sweden we call it boiling a soup on a nail, like a nail hammer, like you're making something out of nothing. They couldn't find very much of the module saying that, women should stay in the quick kitchen, or blacks are monkeys, or whatever. So they had to do these ridiculous things, like, go into the really weird stuff, like fat phobia. Ogres are no longer fat. They are now well fed. And that's like a very important part of the inclusivity review process. Well, your question was the forces pushing this. Like, I think that with the George Floyd protests and riots, there was a push for the bigger corporate structures behind these companies, Hasbro, in this case, owned by BlackRock and Vanguard and organizations like that, who were basically motivated by ESG to do this. And so these people who had no influence whatsoever, and I don't think ever had the shops to force themselves into the hobby to become so hegemonic as they are today, they suddenly were lifted up from nothing to more or less commanding the main outputs of the game.
It was sort of a color revolution. An outside power, looks at a polity and says, "We want something changed. Find the guys who agree with us."
Yeah.
You've seen as an American, our foreign policy establishment has done this any number of times.
Yeah.
Find some minor political party, you give them a ton of support, and all of a sudden they control the nation, despite the fact they're nowhere near qualified to do something like that. And look, I realize there's a much different scale that we're talking about, but that pattern that you're describing, we've seen it elsewhere. So let's dig into these consultants. One of the things we were talking about before we went live is managerialism, right? When we say the PMC, the professional managerial class, we're talking about a very different or very specific group of people. Now, look, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the members of the PMC who end up writing, progressive policies for tabletop role-playing games are probably not their best and brightest. But this class is much larger than just this. We see it everywhere. So what would you consider the sort of, I guess, what are the, I'm fumbling for words here, what are the characteristics of that class? Where else do we see them? And particularly, I know you connected this to a sort of similar group of people in Swedish politics.
Yeah. Well, it's so on the one hand, you have managerialism, a concept developed by James Burnham, who was a former Marxist, but sort of like a dark Marxist, a sort of counter Marxist in many ways. The managerial revolution is within a Marxist framework entirely, but he sort of switches things around a bit. And then you have the development of the PMC term. I don't know who coins it, but it's what are the names of those? There are two Marxists in the 80s really popularizing it, but I think they were building on the works of C. Wright Mills and stuff like that. And there's sort of been this entangling of the professional class and the managerial class. And I think it's pretty important to, the PMC is often discussed as a class in itself, with professionals being their main. They don't just sell their labor, they don't own capital, and they don't own land, but they have professional skills, which are usually synonymous with credentials from a university, giving them, there are different ways you could attack this from. They could either be extracting rent from limited skills, like a true profession, like a surgeon or whatever. They can have absurd wages because the supply of these surgeons is very limited. But they could also be, you could also see them as a more ideological group, as in this case, blah, blah, blah. The point is, however, that most professionals are not, in fact, managers. Most managers do have some professional credentials, but these two groups, I think, should be held apart. And Sorry, what was the question again, Jay?
So sorry, several things there. As the audience is probably aware, we are having connectivity issues. I'll edit around it. It has made a cohesive discussion somewhat difficult. But effectively, what are the characteristics of the PMC, which I think you've gotten to?
Yeah.
When do we see them arising? And lastly, you mentioned, and this was in your conversation with the good old boys, that there's sort of a particularly useful example of kind of make work jobs for the PMC in Sweden. Look, like that's a specific example to your country, but it's something we see, I would argue, even in the example of Hasbro, but I'll throw it to you there.
Yeah.
So I guess there's 2 points left to address.
Yeah, so let's just get to that. So on the one hand, you have professionals or this and this and that. They can have real skills as surgeons or whatever, or they can have more like ideological skills. And then there are the managers, and they're quite different. And I think what's been happening, there's been a lot of talk about an overproduction of elites. That was like in the discourse a few years ago. These people shouldn't be considered elites in regards to their skill, and they shouldn't be considered elites in regard to their actual power as a ruling class or whatever. But there has been an overproduction of these highly educated people unable to find work. And just due to their mass, due to their quantity, they've been exerting like a pressure on several sectors of the economy for quite a long time. And they have, like, when we talk about professional woke writers and designers for Dungeons and Dragons, they are not elite, and they don't have any skill. They don't have any actual class power to force themselves into companies. But there's been a sort of dark alliance between a separate managerial class and a professional class, where the former are using the latter sort of as stooges to affect the image of the company. Does that make sense?
No, definitely. I think as well, and I take a lot from Burnham. I don't really consider myself a Marxist, but class analysis is a very useful tool. And to me, it sort of gels with what you see from someone like Ebola, who talks about the different types of ruling classes. He talks about a society ruled by warriors, something like a feudal society, whereas ours is sort of a combination of a society ruled by merchants, which is obviously capital, and then priests, which is sort of this managerial class. And when I say priests, I don't mean literally like they pray to God, but they're an immoral enforcement tool. And one of the things that I think about quite often is that in the feudal era, the second sons often ended up in the priesthood, right? The failures who maybe weren't good enough, and I'm attaching a moral weight to this, who were not necessarily warrior material, who would not be the baron, would end up as a priest or a bishop. And you mentioned earlier that many of these people have poor scholarship. They're not the best and the brightest, but it almost functions as a welfare system for them and for that class, that there is always a position for them to sort of fall into. Am I stretching this metaphor too far, or do you think that there's something to that? The PMC, or this part of the PMC, is like a priestly caste?
I don't think you are, but I think it's also important to remember that in the Middle Ages, when you had these sort of fail sons of the warrior class, they were sent off to die in Jerusalem or in like the Baltics or whatever. They just send their surplus aristocracy to die. And you could send, like, the clerics back in those days actually filled a function. They weren't only like ideological. They were, before nation states were formed, they formed like the Catholic Church was the main producer of bureaucrats and advisors to the king and stuff like that. And you probably had a problem with like a surplus population of these people as well. But you're in a weird situation today where, like in Sweden, it's very clear. Like in the 90s, there was like a collapse of industry in Sweden. And in Germany, they solved this by freezing real wages and keeping unemployment at very low levels. And in Germany, you have all these like craft schools and trade schools and stuff like that. But in Sweden, the Social Democrat strategy was to, in the words of the old Prime Minister Göran Persson, it was to fight So, in the words of the old Prime Minister Göran Persson, in Sweden, you invested in knowledge instead of freezing real wages and blah, blah, blah. And you had this hope of this, in this new post-industrial society, producing like a great cast of engineers and people heightening productivity and stuff like that. But that never really happened. And you find yourselves today in a situation with a group of overproduced people who you can't send away to die in a crusade in the Baltics. You can't like really get rid of them. And I think, I don't know a lot about like the labor market in America or whatever, but you've had this expansion of the college system over there as well. And there's been an overproduction, not of elites in a quality sense, but just an overproduction of, useless bureaucrats and professionals, and they have to go somewhere.
Oh, certainly. I think that what we have, and I've killed my camera to preserve the connection. See if that helps. Yeah. What we have is similarly, there was a drive to get people into education. Maybe good intention, maybe not. At the same time that there was massive deindustrialization. Effectively, the idea was we don't need those sort of jobs anymore. We'll just push everyone into education, and also mass immigration. Yeah. So wages have been horribly stagnant, really, since the 70s. I got into a lot of trouble on the internet last week by just crunching the numbers, saying, okay, how much as a percentage of median wage was a house when your grandparents were young? How about a used car? How about a new car? The things that you need to live a life. And everything has gotten massively expensive when compared to the median wage. So there are a lot of people, and I say this, normal people, who are not really academics, who are not in the top 5 or 10% of IQ, who have been shuffled into those positions for several reasons. One is that it is sort of a sponge for unemployment. Well, you're not unemployed, you're pursuing an advanced degree. So you sort of stay out of the labor market for a long time. Also, it functions as, and this is to go back to points Bog Beef has made before, it is a massive patronage network. It is a massive organization that you can stick people into, particularly these sort of managerial types. You can look at this in education. Education, particularly higher education, has grown massively. But within that growth, almost all of it has been in administration. I know this with regards to high school in the U.S., right? So 13 to 18, plus or minus. The student population in America, I think, has grown about 15% since the year 2000. Administrators have grown by 100% to a massive degree. So that dynamic you're talking about is completely and totally correct. And you have many people, really due to no fault of their own, who do not have the opportunity to have quote unquote normal jobs anymore. They're funneled into this sort of degree credentialing process. Sorry, I got on a bit of a tear there, but I'll throw it back to you.
I think it's interesting. And just like, I have this sort of long shit list in the article about all of these, they're hired as consultants, but I don't even know what to call them. Like, they're not, a lot of times they don't actually write the material. They don't even design the mechanics of the game. Sometimes they do, but they're mostly like sensitivity reader is usually what they describe themselves as, and it's some sort of editorial role. And like, when you go through these people through this list, first of all, they don't have a like impressive university credentials, but they also describe themselves as very precarious, like going from job to job. A lot of them, well, I don't want to be mean, but there are like more than one of them selling their skills as being like mentally ill. And they've gone through all these, like, they've had a really rough life. They've been living as some sort of bohemian writer going from job to job, and that they sell that as a credential. Like, this is why I am on like the margins, and I'm a marginalized person. I'm oppressed somehow, and I give these skills. And they really shouldn't have gone to college. They really should have gotten a real job, and they're sort of, I don't know, they're just the bottom of the barrel of like a big jobs program, and they need somewhere to go. And they get very creative with it. Like, ways of extorting people through morality and ideology. And yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that additionally, and this is probably sort of cynical, but you mentioned earlier that this is pushed by finance capital. This is inorganic. And I think it was, I can't remember which one of the Italians. It was De Juvenal, I believe, who talked about the sort of the high and the low versus the middle. That elites will use this tactic to sort of screen out possible rivals by creating an underclass and very cynically using them as sort of a wrecking ball, right, to get what they want. And obviously there are levels to this. You can look at it the macro to the micro, but I think that there's something with that as well with these, diversity consultants, particularly within a hobby, because as you've said, oftentimes the people who become these sort of diversity commissars are not particularly competent, are not the people who naturally would have, risen to the top of any community, but they are sort of lifted up, put on high, they're in charge. And certainly, there's an element, and Spandrel called it bio-Leninism, right? Which is the idea of, by taking an undeserving person who knows that they're undeserving, you have created a very devoted political servant, because they understand that if that artificial, pressure keeping them in place goes away, they are no longer, they are no longer sort of at the top of the heap. Do you think that there's some of that here as well?
I think so. In the article, I mostly focus on these people being hired to pump ESG scores, so we can get into that later. But I was listening to a pretty good documentary about the founding of TSR, as it was called back then, the original publishers of Dungeons and Dragons. And they always had this tension of like designers being like pretty good at their job, being prepared to work for like shitty wages, but always being like in conflict with management because they wanted to actually produce like a good product. And tabletop gaming has always struggled with profitability, just how with like the printing industry works. And like if you buy the Dungeons Master's Guide, you have the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's really no, and you play the game in your imagination. So there's always been this tension with like designers working for like a very long period of time to produce relatively like few products, and like the demands of management. And I think there is something here that there's a good to like whip these designers into shape. There can be a pretty sound management strategy to hire desperate people with an inflated view of their own capability, who will still like be very, very thankful to the managers hiring them, and who are like very unsure of themselves, who therefore will be like spiteful and resentful to the people who actually know what they're doing. And there is a sort of like divide and conquer aspect to this, I think. You can see this like in Blizzard, the publishers of World of Warcraft and stuff like that. Like you always had these sort of unruly game designers who always had these like pretty strong principles of what the game should be and shouldn't be. And that can come into conflict with the profit motive, basically. So yeah, in like a sort of absurd situation, you sort of want to make the product worse and just fill the company with these useless people who are forever loyal to the people hiring them, and like one of their sole purposes to make the designers more malleable. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. You see this this is a weird example, but in the UFC, right? The MMA championship.
Oh yeah.
They have a perverse incentive where, because of the way that they are compensated, and they've successfully lobbied the government in such a way that they are exempt from laws which govern other professional athletes. But if they create a champion, someone who's very popular, and they stick around for a long time. Well, that guy can leave because he's a big name and people want to see him. Where instead, if they hire, and I think currently they have 700 fighters on their roster, which is absurd, they can shovel out, dozens and dozens of events with very few people who have any other choice than to perform for them at very low wages. And sure, it doesn't, the product may be worse, but you are the default answer. You are the Coca-Cola. And so, sure, will other people find an alternative? Yes. And we've seen a boom in alternative tabletop games, certainly in alternative wargaming, which is sort of my particular flavor of autism. But even then, the vast majority of people will not go elsewhere. Yeah. So I wanted to turn to ESG because, look, I'll be 100% honest. Most of the time I hear about ESG, it's from someone who sounds crazy, right? It's from some boomer talking about, Bill Gates and barcodes and adrenochrome. But there is something there. So do you want to define that term ESG and then explain how it matters to specifically tabletop gaming?
Yeah, it stands for, I think, equity, social governance or something like that. And it's basically
environmental, isn't it?
Environmental, yeah, it might be. And it started as purely an environmental thing where so you have these financial markets more and more dominated by passive investors with the innovation of ETFs being able to rule, I'm simplifying greatly here, but being able to rule the financial market by a very non-personalized process, sort of almost automated. But this led to the problem of if you hand up the Norwegian pension fund or oil fund, even if they want to hand over all their money to BlackRock, they want to make sure that they don't invest it in a company that hires child soldiers or whatever, but originally that they have a low carbon footprint. So you made this sort of artificial point system called ESG to give a risk rating to companies. So the Shell oil company, for example, has had a lot of problems with ESG because the carbon footprint is the category that still gives the highest risk rating. And they can't really do anything about their carbon footprint, which is why they're pushing. They've added on to ESG. They've added on to most importantly for our conversation here, they've added on these sort of inclusivity things. I want to make sure that this is a company that doesn't discriminate, that this is a company that isn't socially conservative, I guess. So that's why we have these absurd situations where the Shell oil company can't really do anything about the carbon footprint, but they can put homosexuals in all their ads and stuff like that. So they can pump their ESG score. And Wizards of the Coast, again, the publisher of D&D, they have sort of the reverse problem that the carbon footprint is pretty low, and they don't run a risk of hiring child soldiers to extract oil in Africa. But what they can do, there's no roof to it, is pump up their ESG score by doing the products that they actually sell is there's some mechanical things, this is a dungeon with a grid that decides how far there are between objects and how far your characters can move and stuff like that. But mostly it's art and it's narrative. It's mostly just inspiration for your imagination that they're selling. So you could do anything. The sky is the limit what you can put into these sort of things. And I think more and more this is what's happening because Dungeons & Dragons, the product, is not very profitable. Wizards of the Coast, their profits lies in Magic the Gathering, the card game. And Hasbro has more and more started moving to licensing with the Transformers movies and stuff like that, because Hasbro also produces the Transformer toy line. And Dungeons & Dragons is a very strong brand. You can see how it was used in the Stranger Things TV show. So they want to hold on to the brand, but they don't want to focus as the manager of these companies, you look at something like Dungeons & Dragons and you think what can I do with this? I want to keep the brand. It might come in handy. I might be able to license it to video games or movies or whatever. But they're here, we have people on the payroll who are here every day. What can they do? And I think they've come to realize that just pumping ESG score just for the sake of it has become like a big utility. Well, not a. It's one of the utilities you can actually get out of the product. You get what I'm saying?
Oh, 100%. You see this with the success of Baldur's Gate 3, which actually, and not to get on a rant about Baldur's Gate 3, I have strong feelings about that. That game is frustrating because it has great mechanics and some of the most irritating writing of anything I've ever. It is the like theater kiddification of D&D in one product. Discussion for another time, not that important. But I think that that's an interesting point as well about the sort of moving on from first making a product, making something that you can physically sell, then you sort of turning that into like an intellectual property, and then taking it into an intellectual property that you don't even yourself actually do anything with. You simply collect the rent on letting someone else do things with it. It's incredibly irritating, especially when you consider, intellectual property. And look, like I'm not one of these autistic libertarians who believe that intellectual property shouldn't exist, but a limited understanding of it makes a lot of sense, right? The idea that, if you in your backyard, develop some new chemical, well, you should be rewarded for that, right? You should probably be a rich man. The idea that something, as simple as, and I don't mean to be rude, but D&D is a very ill-defined setting. It's basically everything from every fantasy put into a blender, right? It's not rocket science. And the idea that could simply be locked down for generations and sold to let other people use it, right? As limited access is, I don't know, it's infuriating to me.
But I also think the vagueness of the setting, I think that's key to why originally I thought this was like a sign of disease, like the whole product, the company is going down the shitter. But more and more I'm thinking, like the game is basically, I describe a scenario to you, like you walk down a road, there's a big rock in the way, try to move the rock. I roll a 20-sided dice, you need 15 to move the rock. Yeah, I only rolled 10, but I have 15, so I move it. That's the game. You don't need like anything to actually play the game. So like, I think that's why you can't like really ruin it, because if you release this shit product, but it has like good art and some okay like battle maps or whatever, players can still like do whatever they want with it, and they're still gonna come back to Wizards of the Coast because they're like the biggest, and they produce the most, and they have the strongest brand and everything. But it doesn't necessarily have to ruin the hobby, which is why I think this can go on for quite some time. I don't know. Have you seen the Rings of Power TV series, the Lord of the Rings show?
Well, I did. It's look, I'm sort of a masochist with entertainment, and I will quite regularly make my friends who love a property or love a book watch a very bad adaptation of it. So, for instance, one of my friends loved Cowboy Bebop. When the live action came out, I made him watch it with me. It was hilarious. Very fun. Rings of Power was so boring. Like, it was bad, but it wasn't even entertaining. I gave up that game after 2 episodes. I was like, I'm doing this out of ill will, right? To ruin someone else's day. And it's not fun even then. But yes, I am familiar.
I watched 4 episodes before giving up. And I'm for like intellectual reasons, I'm considering watching all of it, because that show is pretty fascinating. It's very, very bad. That should be said. And it's like the world Tolkien created was like a very specific thing. It's basically, Tolkien scholars would probably argue with me, but it's basically like European mythology, Catholicism, and like consider like the Chronicle of Beowulf. It's basically that, but as a new mythology where like the explicit connections to actual history, well, they're not made explicit, but it's based on that theme. And like, as you said, Dungeons and Dragons, it's just this mishmash of all fancy elements, and like it's an interactive thing, so you can make whatever you want with it. But you have there's this great scene in Rings of Power where you find out that the orcs can have children, and that the orcs are sort of like a subaltern subject. They're sort of like the hyenas in Lord of the Rings, who like from a sympathetic perspective could be seen as if like, oh, they live on the margins and they have shit game to hunt, so they have to be like this. And they're sort of like, and that's why they flock to Sauron as a sort of anti-colonial sort of figure. But the thing, like, the show still needs there to be objective evil. There needs to be a dark lord. So if you say that the orcs are, I don't know, like Congolese freedom fighters or whatever, and they still flock to a guy who is basically like the devil, doesn't that like make it worse? Doesn't that like make it more racist? And it completely subverts like the entire logic of the Lord of the Rings world, of Middle Earth. But that's, and you know, there was this article coming out recently that I think it's Netflix, I think, or HBO, I don't know, but they're losing millions and millions of dollars from that show because they bought the license from the Tolkien estate, and they have some sort of clause where they gotta keep producing it, and no one's watching. And it's like, that's an example of these kinds of things like not working, like being very, very costly for the company. But I think there's a difference here with D&D. I think it could sort of go on forever, and maybe video games too, because you know, you can put up with a lot of stupid bullshit writing, but as long as the game is mechanically good, you'll still be coming back. So you get like, you actually sell games and you pump your ESG score at the same time.
I want to get to that anti-colonial ideology you mentioned.
Yeah.
Because I think that in a lot of, let's just say like woke classic, that ideology functions as a sort of American cultural imperialism, as a way to
which is very ironic, but yeah, go on.
I know, exactly. It is. Which is actually why, in a weird way, I end up pulling a lot from decolonialist thinkers, but not at all in the way they want me to, right? But there's this idea, and it's from Moldbug, I believe, that Massachusetts conquered the world. That the ideology and the culture of the American Yankee, right, the Northern Puritan stock of America, that is what is now woke. Right, that sort of combination of, you know, culture, ideology has outlived even really the contiguous existence of that population. There's more to go on there, right? I don't want to get into it, but in much the same way that you see first the sort of cultural re-engineering of the American South, then Europe, and then the world, right? After a sequence of, shall we say, dramatic world events, I'll leave it at that. And, you know, even now there's this sort of ideology of, I mean, it really is like the ideology of American managerialism. And woke is sort of like the enforcement method of that. So let's get into, when we say, you know, anti-colonialist, and then why it is such an odd fit in this space. So what do you mean when you say that term, anti-colonialist?
Well, post-colonialist, to be precise, but it's like, so, you know, wokeness in general, in the article I go through the 3 women who were on the board of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, and I don't remember their names, but they're pretty famous in America, I think. Ayo Tumeti is the only one I remember because it's such a peculiar name. And they sort of pull from different kinds of strands, like post-colonialism, but intersectionality, and some sort of watered-down version of Black nationalism and stuff like that. But what's interesting with Dungeons & Dragons is that all of these consultants credited in the books, if you go to their LinkedIn profiles on the web pages, like a vast majority of them make explicit references to post-colonial theory. And there's a lot of things you can say about that, because it's like, one key aspect of post-colonialism is sort of disenchanting the West's ideological construction of what the East is, or the non-West, basically. And that, like, fantasy is like an enchantment of history. It's stereotyping, it's simplifying. So already there, you know, you bump into some kind of issues. But what I think is interesting, I'm planning to write a sequel to this article, like the consequences of Tolkien's, I guess, like essentialism and other stuff like that, how that sort of doesn't really work with like a post-colonial perspective. I'm rambling, but so post-colonialism as a tradition comes up with Frantz Fanon, who's like this black Frenchman who fights with the FLN, you call it in Swedish, I think, but the Algerian anti-colonial movement. And his entire idea is like, he's a psychiatrist. So his entire contribution is analyzing what like imperial domination does to a subject people, and how you, like, he wrote this book called Black Skin, White Masks, where it's like you see yourself through the eyes of your overlord and you define yourself through their values and stuff like that. And then you have Edward Said, who writes Orientalism, and it's sort of the same thing. Like when Napoleon comes to the Middle East and he, with like his imperialist project, he also colonizes their body of knowledge and like reframes it. Because like in the Arab world, you didn't have these sort of cultural institutions that appeared in Europe in the 19th and 18th century. You didn't have like a structured system of knowledge of your own culture. So like when the European imperialists arrive, they do what the Brothers Grimm did with Germanic folklore. Like they pick and choose and they make it into like a coherent body of work. Do you say that? I think so.
They canonize it effectively.
Yeah, they canonize it. And that's like Said's entire thing, that it was canonized for imperial purposes. And like, you know, the book Orientalism is really, really good. It has a lot of flaws, but it's really, really interesting. But what's become interesting, like, so this served a purpose of criticizing not only American, also French, but like colonial domination of non-Western countries. But it has now become, post-colonialism has come to be used as a way of understanding American multiculturalism and American racial politics. And it's sort of like, say what you will about like racial minorities in America, but like Afro-Americans are Americans. They don't have any continuous relationship to Western Africa. They don't have any like other culture on like the uppermost, like on the broadest, like you can talk about subcultures, but they are culturally American. And you try to use these sort of frames to, like, first of all, post-colonialism is meant to deconstruct narratives and myth-making about history. And that is what fantasy is. So applying post-colonialism to a fantasy setting is just destroying fantasy. And then post-colonialism was never meant for the imperial core. It was meant for the imperial subjects. But in a very imperialist sort of way, like the empire has taken over post-colonialism to like reshape it into something to understand themselves. It's like, it's very layered.
No, certainly. And that's sort of and this is something you see in all empires, that the issues of the periphery sort of come home. So you see this in the American context, where because of mass immigration, issues at the fringes of the empire are now being fought out in like the American legislature. So for instance, Ilhan Omar, I'm not trying to, turn this into boomer rage about, a Democratic politician, but she describes herself as an advocate for her people. That is why she is there. She's very passionate about issues that affect Somalians. You see this with, shall we say, a prominent Mediterranean democracy. The Armenian genocide, there's a reason that that's something that comes up a weird amount in America in certain political races. And it's that, there are Armenian groups that are very powerful. And in much the same way, right, the exterior cultural acid and, used to attack others, it sort of ultimately has sort of come home. And look, like when I say American, I'm speaking about like the empire, not the country. There's an important distinction to be made there. I know I'm going to get people upset about it. But I think it's especially interesting when we understand that America as an anti-colonial force, that was an opportunistic thing, right? That was a way to bring Europe into our sphere of cultural control. So you look at Vietnam, right? America ended French Indochina not to necessarily, end occupation by Western forces, but to do it themselves, right? To bring it in. And look, I'm someone who thinks that there was actually a decent geopolitical reason for doing so, but it was fundamentally not a moral gambit. Sorry, Andrew, I'm all over the place here, but it was an interesting point. And I think it's also interesting that model of colonialism doesn't match the American experience at all. Like, yeah, sure, technically, there were indigenous peoples here, but like it was a very different relationship from North Africa, right? The French, or in Southeast Asia, or even in South America. It was a very different thing. Our continent was much, much less populated, and to be honest, much less organized. The pre-Columbian peoples, especially in North America, I mean, by the standards of civilization, didn't have a lot going on. So it's an inadequate frame, but nonetheless, because it has been absorbed into sort of the secular, state religion of the PMC, it is one that is sort of forced on us.
Yeah.
And I'll throw it back to you.
And I think it's something I haven't really made up my mind about, but there's something like, if you talk about like black nationalism in America, for example, and you go back to someone like Marcus Garvey, he was a nationalist in the proper sense. Like the black belt of America should secede to form a nation, or we should get like a strip of land back in Africa or something like that. That's like nationalism in the true sense. And like being anti-colonial was not about like criticizing conceptions in the West of poor people in the East or whatever. It was also like, I want to break off this strip of land should not be a colony. It should be an independent nation state. And the way people use these ideas in the West, there has been like a great lowering of standards. If you read the biography of one of these Black Lives Matter ladies, I don't remember which one, but she goes through all of these ideas, and she talks about like national liberation, socialist revolution, and all these kinds of stuff. And she boils it down to, today we can use this in America to criticize a hegemonic idea that in the media only white people should be represented or whatever. And she lifts as a great cultural like victory that there is now like an Afro-Latino Spider-Man and like a gay Batwoman and stuff like that. And there's been this I think it's kind of interesting that like people mobilize these very high-flying political theoretical ideas, but it's just this very, very thin like excuse to win like very, very petty cultural struggles. And I don't really know what my point there is, but there's something interesting. Like they have this radical posture, and they have all these ideas that have nothing to do with the reason they were like invented, and just apply them to like guilt trip people in the imperial court to get like petty cultural goodie bags.
It's exactly, it is a tool used cynically. And it's why when talking to these people, if you enter into their frame, you have already lost, because it is not a frame that they themselves are actually in, right? It is sort of a mask that they are pulling on to get something that they want. And in the same way, ESG is sort of cynically distorted to serve as a means to an end. I think you see the exact same thing with the use of that ideology. That, when you boil down, through all of the, the writing, it is effectively like BS, BS, BS. Give me what I want. Give me that. Yeah. And look, like maybe you could say that about all ideology. I think that's perhaps a bit too cynical, but I think that is ultimately at the center of that is, and it's this line, I think it's from Dune, right? When you were in power, I asked for mercy. Now that I am in power, I will offer you none. Where it seems to be very much that. But one other thing I think is important to mention is that you sort of see the exact same mechanism used around the word, like, inclusivity or accessibility within a hobby. That is the moral framework used to slip in the narrow end of the wedge, right? Like, oh, we just want a little space for our thing. We just want, sort of a nod. And very quickly, and look, as someone who at one point in his life was a 40K fan, I've seen this happen very quickly, that once that inch is given, the knife is plunged in, and all of a sudden you're getting, that full expression of kind of, woke cultural contrition.
Yeah.
So we are fast approaching time. Hopefully, I will be able to get this into a salvageable form. I, by the way, found out the issue with my internet. Someone's been stealing it, which is super cool. So I'm going to get to change my passwords. But if people want to find more of you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, you should go to my Substack called Mark of the Weather Sun. It's a pretty convoluted name, but it's a very clever reference to Swedish medieval history. So you should enjoy it.
Well, sure thing. I highly recommend your article. I will link that as well as your appearance on The Good Old Boys. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to it. If you want to support me, you can either do that directly by heading over to Substack, Subscribestar, Gumroad, or Patreon. You'll get the episodes early and ad-free, or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. JD is a really good guy, sponsored me forever, and I'm really bad at being sponsored. I forget to do his ad read almost every time I'm live on air. So click the link down in the description. You'll get 2 weeks free, whatever you want, and tell him I sent you. Again, I appreciate it, man. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.
Good night.